now like to give a presentation. This is one I've worked on for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I've entitled it Art and Investing. In 1932, Pablo Picasso painted one of his most intimate works. The title of the painting, Nude, Green Leaves, and Bust. And the subject was his lover, Marie Therese Walter. This painting stands over 5 feet tall, and it radiates in kind of bold blues and pinks, which might be hard to tell up on the screen, but Picasso actually painted this painting in a single day. It was more than art, it was a love letter in paint. Less than 20 years later, Los Angeles collectors Sidney and Francis Brody acquired this piece for just under $20,000. Unlike many wealthy collectors who lent their art to museums, the Brodys chose privacy. And so for nearly 6 decades, this hung in their Beverly Hills home, and only a few close friends ever saw it. It was a secret masterpiece that was whispered about, but never on display. And that all changed in 2010, when Francis Brody passed away, and they entrusted Christie's to sell this piece at an auction. And when the art was publicly unveiled, the art world erupted. On auction day, 5 determined bidders bid up the price. In over 8 minutes, the hammer finally fell, and it was a new world record for a painting sold at auction, $106 million. You know, $106 million is a lot of money. But the interesting thing is, fast forward 15 years to today, and it would even show up in the top 10 list. The current painting that sold for the highest price at auction is this one. Salvator Mundi, it's Latin for savior of the world. Painted around 1500, it was long dismissed and thought lost. It resurfaced in 2005, just 20 years ago, when 2 art dealers bought it for $1,000. You heard that right. 2005, they bought it for a little over $1,000. The painting had a lot of overpainting in it. There were a lot of touch-ups, and it was kind of hard to even see. And they actually hired a restorer named Diane Menestini, who spent several years painstakingly uncovering the work, revealing details that suggested that Leonardo da Vinci's own hand painted this. And the 2 pictures up on the screen are kind of a before and after refurbishment. But by 2011, this painting hung in London's National Gallery, labeled as a Leonardo. And the art world was electrified, yet doubts still lingered about its authenticity. But then in 2017 came the record-shattering moment. Christie's sold this painting for $450 million, the highest price ever paid for a painting. The buyer was reported to be a Saudi crown prince, and it was promised to be on display in the Louvre in Paris, but it never showed up. And so the world's most expensive painting has vanished, its whereabouts unknown, and its authenticity still fiercely debated. I've listed up on the screen here a list of the highest prices ever paid for art. You know, obviously we see Salvator Mundi up at the top, and each one of these paintings has a similar story of mystery, of scarcity, of discovery, and the prices paid are astounding. And I've listed some of the buyers and sellers of this artwork so you get a feel for the types of individuals that transact in this artwork at these prices. As you can imagine, they aren't normal individuals. They are Russian oligarchs, Saudi princes, billionaire hedge fund managers, royal families that are trying to make their country a destination for the rich, famous, and cultured. Since you and I, and probably most everyone in this room, will likely never own a piece of art in the top 10 or probably in the top 100, it's important for everyone to understand the relationship between artist, gallery, collector, museum. Artists produce the art, galleries showcase the artist's work, collectors buy the art, and then collectors are encouraged to lend, give, or sell the masterpieces to museums so the public could enjoy them. You know, if you ask any respected artist what they would hope for their art, it isn't to sit in the living room of a billionaire's home. It's actually, their hope and desire would be that it would be on display so the public could enjoy it. So museums play this critical role for passing on the finest art from rich to poor. One of the most prominent museums in the United States is the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. The National Gallery exists today because of the generosity of Andrew Mellon. And Andrew Mellon was one of the richest men in America at the time. He was a financier, an industrialist. He was actually the Secretary of Treasury for a time being. But Mellon wasn't content with wealth alone. He wanted his legacy to be something lasting. And so in 1936, a little less than a year before he died, he actually offered the US government his personal art collection, then valued at $40 million, roughly $1 billion in today's inflation-adjusted dollars. He also offered another $15 million to build a home for it on the National Mall. And unfortunately, Andrew Mellon would die just 8 months later, and he never got to see the masterpiece he built for the country. But his dream was to create an American institution that could rival Europe's greatest museums, the Louvre in Paris, the National Gallery in London. He really wanted Americans to experience the masterpieces of history without having to cross an ocean. The job for designing the building fell on architect John Russell Pope. He also designed the Jefferson Memorial. And Mellon was attracted to Pope's neoclassical designs, think marble columns, sweeping rotundas, grand galleries. And this visually reflected what Mellon wanted America to project: stability, elegance, timelessness. On March 17, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt stood before the new museum and declared it dedicated forever to the use and enjoyment of the people. And even though Mellon had already passed away 3 years prior, other great collectors kind of followed his lead in contributing artwork to the museum. Samuel Crest donated Renaissance pieces. The Widener family donated Rembrandts and Vermeers. Chesterdale contributed French Impressionists. From the very beginning, the gallery was built on generosity. 85 years later, the National Gallery of Art holds over 140,000 pieces of art, and over 4 million people go through its doors every single year. But while the gallery has grown mostly due to the generosity of millionaires and billionaires, its arguably greatest benefactors were an unlikely couple: a man who never made more than $23,000 per year, and his wife, a librarian. Their names were Herb and Dorothy Vogel. Herb was born in Harlem in 1922. He worked nights as a postal clerk in Manhattan, sorting mail. Dorothy was a reference librarian in the Brooklyn Public Library, both public servants. They lived in a 450-square-foot, one-bedroom apartment, surrounded not by luxury, but by stacks of TV dinners and soon-to-be stacks of art. When they married in 1962, they made a pact. Dorothy's salary would pay for their daily living expenses. Herb's salary, every penny, would go towards purchasing art. They set 3 rules for the art that they purchased. Number 1, they had to love it. Number 2, it had to fit inside their tiny 450-square-foot apartment. Number 3, they had to be able to carry it home by taxi or subway. They weren't chasing Rembrandts or Picassos. They hunted for young, emerging artists. They paid cash, often no more than $25 or $50. Sometimes they bartered. Sometimes they even cat-sat to sweeten the deal. Artists loved Herb and Dorothy because they cared. They were genuine, not just for investment, but they cared for the artists themselves. Over the decades, their little apartment transformed into a treasure chest. Every inch of wall and floor space was crammed with art: Chuck Close sketches, Roy Lichtenstein paintings, Andy Goldsworthy sculptures. Curators would visit this tiny 450-square-foot apartment from across the world, and they would leave describing it as one of the most astounding collections in the country. In 1990, the Vogels made a stunning decision. They donated 2,400 works to the National Gallery of Art. Curators at the time called the collection literally priceless. It took 5 40-foot trucks to empty their apartment. 5 40-foot trucks to empty their 450-square-foot apartment. The gallery's director at the time said the Vogels' collection is a work of art of itself. Think about that. A collection built on a postal worker's salary, rivaling those of the world's wealthiest families. What did the Vogels get for this donation? Well, the gallery gave them a modest lifetime annuity. And what do you think they did with this modest lifetime annuity? Did they upgrade their apartment? Did they travel the world? No. They bought more art. They would buy another 1,500 pieces until Herb's death in 2012. In the end, the Vogels gave away more than 4,000 works, distributing them to museums in all 50 states. Every corner of America now houses a piece of the Vogels' art collection. And here's the part that always stops me. They never sold a single piece. They could have been multimillionaires 100 times over. But they just didn't do it for the money. They didn't do it to get rich. They just collected what they loved, and then they gave it all away. When I first heard heard of Herb and Dorothy's story, I couldn't help but think about the similarities of their story and the art of successful microcap investing. Herb and Dorothy sought out starving artists before they became famous. They weren't interested in buying Rembrandts and Picassos, they couldn't afford them. And so in their limited income, they sought out undiscovered artists. Great collectors, like great investors, see talent before the institutions do. Herb and Dorothy not only discovered many great artists before they were known, but they also got to know them and they supported them. They became what I would call value-added collectors. And it's in the same way that the best investors become value-added investors to the companies they invest in. Herb and Dorothy gave budding artists advice that would oftentimes help define and amplify their careers. Through this mentoring, Herb and Dorothy built a reputation where emerging artists sought them out for advice. And it's sort of the same thing with investing. The best deals don't land in your inbox. They come through a combination of hard work, networks, reputations, and a long history of proving you add value. If you ask a seasoned art collector, why they bought a painting, they'll often say, because I wanted to live with it. They buy for love, not just for money. And kind of good investors say the same thing in a similar way. They invest in companies they believe in deeply enough to hold when everyone else doubts them. Passion is the fuel that sustains conviction when the world tells you you're wrong. The longer I invest, the more the ultimate measure isn't financial. It's whether you spotted something enduring before the rest of the world understood it. The Vogel's collection now lives in museums. Buffett's investments live in the archives of business history. Legacy is what endures. Up on the screen is a list of the top 15 best performing companies ever profiled on Microcap Club. These are the equivalent of finding the Salvator Mundis or the rare Picasso or Rembrandt. Finding them early makes you a legend. Legend is Paul Andriola finding Expel at 36 cents in 2013. It's a 90-bagger. Legend is Joe Boscovich profiling LEU at $6 just 5 years ago. It's a 60-bagger. Legend is our very own Jeff Cole. Where's Jeff? He's here with us. He profiled Almonte Industries 18 months ago at 60 cents. I think it's up 1,900% in the last 18 months. When you see whether you're discovering great artists early, like the Vogels, or discovering great companies early, like the investors up here on the screen, it can be a very lonely pursuit. If you go back and look at each one of the company threads on Microcap Club, of each one of these companies up here on the screen, you'll see gaps. You'll see gaps that last weeks, months, quarters, maybe even years, where it's just the original author posting, just the original author commenting. No one else is commenting. No one else seems to care. When the Vogels started collecting art in the 1960s, it took 20 or 25 years for anybody to even know who they were. No acclaim, no recognition, just them and their passion and conviction. Whether it's art or investing, it always feels lonely before it feels legendary. Thank you.